Our next guest is trying to become the first former Republican vice president to win the White House since George H.W. Bush in 1988, and only the third in history to serve as VP and come back later to win the White House. The others, Richard Nixon and, of course, Joe Biden. I'm joined now by former Vice President Mike Pence. Mr. Vice President, good morning. It is great to have you on.
Thank you, Rob. Good to be here.
See you.
Good morning to you.
So here we are. It feels more real now. Labor Day is come and gone. You've spent a lot of time in places like New Hampshire and Iowa. What changes now for the campaign heading into fall?
Well, I think it's just a matter of a lot of shoe leather, a lot of time with people. We'll be back in Iowa in a couple of days. Had a great Labor Day series of stops all across New Hampshire. And I'm running for president because I think this country's in a lot of trouble. I think Joe Biden has weakened America at home and abroad. And everywhere I go, I see a determination among the American people to forge leadership for this country that'll secure our border, revive our economy, and strengthen our nation in every way, even as we defend our liberties and our most cherished values. But I also believe that there's a real desire for new leadership in the Republican Party. Everywhere I go, the encouragement that we've been receiving, Rob, has been very humbling for me. I think
you feel that out on the road?
I really do. I'm running, and I say this with humility, as I believe the most qualified, the most consistent, the most tested conservative in this race. And as I said a day or two ago in New Hampshire, I think increasingly Republican voters are starting to look at not just who will be our standard bearer, but what we will run on. And I believe the majority of Republicans, independents, and many Democrats want us to get back to those time-honored conservative principles that have defined our movement over the last 50 years and have defined my career.
So something you said in New Hampshire a day ago is getting a lot of attention. You said, quote, "Should the new populism of the right seize and guide our party, the Republican Party we've long known will cease to exist and the fate of American freedom would be in doubt," which sounds like you're almost trying to hang populism around the neck of Donald Trump, which is interesting because you could argue that's what got him elected in the first place. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think in 2016, Donald Trump made a promise to the American people that we would govern as conservatives. I think when he added me to the ticket, someone that's been in the conservative movement for my entire adult life, I think it was in some ways evidence of that. And Rob, we did govern as conservatives. I mean, we stood with our allies, stood up to our enemies. We rebuilt our military. We used military force to defend our interest and defend the interest of our allies around the world.
Right.
At home, we got the economy moving by letting people keep more of what they earn. We stood for the right to life, appointing 3 of the justices to the Supreme Court that overturned Roe versus Wade. But what I would suggest now is not just the former president, but others in the field that would imitate his posture. Is that it seems like we're walking away from our historic commitment to American leadership in the world. We're walking away from a commitment of fiscal responsibility and even trying to marginalize the right to life. I'm someone that's going to stand strong on that conservative agenda. It's the agenda we governed on for 4 years. And it's what I'll do as President of the United States.
Let me ask you about that. Right now, is this, as you see it, a race against Donald Trump, your former boss, or is it a race for the nomination, against every other candidate in the field?
Well, I actually think it's really wide open. I know that that many other networks think that it's just simply going to be a rematch of 2020. But I honestly think that voters know better than that. Look, Joe Biden's policies have put an incredible burden on American families. We've got mortgage rates at a 22-year high. 2 out of 3 American families are living paycheck to paycheck. We've gone through a period with worst inflation in 40 years. And that's not to mention the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that's emboldened the enemies of freedom around the world. I think people are just now that Labor Day is behind us, they're just now starting to turn their attention to this
Which
field.
Happens. Traditionally, that's when it happens.
It does. And I like our chances, but we're gonna go out and work hard to have people get to know us. Because Rob, one of the things I've learned since the end of our administration is that I'm well known I'm not known well. I mean, most people know me as that loyal vice president standing alongside the president until a day came that my oath to the Constitution required me to do otherwise. But what people may not know, but they're learning more every day, is I was a conservative governor in a state that balanced budgets and cut taxes.
In Congress for more than a decade.
I was a House conservative leader before it was cool. I was fighting against big spending Republicans back in the day, and if I'm president, I'll carry all those same conservative values.
So, Mr. Vice President, people will start voting in about 5 months. It begins in Iowa, then New Hampshire, and then South Carolina's right after that. The Wall Street Journal had some polling out earlier this week, and you were at 2% in that poll. Your unfavorable number was 63, second only to Chris Christie. The people that are watching right now, these are people that you need to vote for you if you want to win the nomination. Tell me what the polls might not be showing. I'm thinking about the ground report for one, but these national polls, they tend to miss a lot of what's really going on in places like New Hampshire and, of course, Iowa.
Well, as you know, the old saying, the only poll that counts is the one that'll take place. That caucus will be on January 15th.
Right.
But, you know, I will say with regard to the Wall Street Journal poll, Rob, I mean, there have been 3 polls that have come out since then that have us with 3 times that level of support. And frankly, our ground report in Iowa has me running pretty consistently second to the former president. But again, I want to emphasize that it's early. And I'm very confident that as we continue to go out there, work our hearts out and articulate our strong conservative agenda. You know, it's not, for me, it's not personal. Sometimes politics gets a little personal. And in NASCAR, they like to say rubbing is racing. You know, we'll bang some fenders along the way in this thing.
That's the Indiana in you right there,
you better
right?
believe it. But, but I got to tell you, I mean, honestly, I have every confidence that as people come to understand the challenges facing this country are only going to be met by going forward on that proven conservative agenda that's defined the Republican Party for 50 years.
When was the last time, Mr. Vice President, that you spoke with your predecessor, Donald Trump?
You know, it's probably was the spring of 2021.
It's been that long.
It has.
Do you want to mend that relationship?
Well, look, I pray for the president. I pray for his family. Look, I'm proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. And
does that bother you, though, that you don't speak with somebody that you'll go down in history attached to, no matter what happens as we move forward?
Let me just say that, you know, that a lot of people don't know that we actually parted amicably even after that difficult day in January of 2021.
Yeah.
Never forget the day the president stood up, the day before we left office, and behind his desk stuck his hand out and said, "You've done a great job." But frankly, in the months that followed, while we spoke a few times, when he returned to some of the same rhetoric suggesting that I had the authority to overturn the election, I thought it's best that we just went our separate ways. But I expect I'll see him down the road, Rob.
Yeah, maybe on a debate stage.
And I'll always be proud of the record of our administration. But I do think it'd be important for him to come to those debates and answer the tough questions and really lay out a vision. My vision is grounded in the conservative ideals that have defined my life and defined our movement, and frankly are at the very heart of the American experiment. But I think him articulating his views, as well as everybody else on the stage, is something we owe Republican voters and the American people.
Just quickly, Mr. Vice President, so people might not be aware, but you're actually a pretty funny guy. I saw an impression you did of the former President George H.W. Bush down in Indiana in July. I'm not going to ask you to do an impression, but do you do anyone other than George W?
Only as the spirit moves, you know.
There's got to be somebody else.
Yes, you know, we talked a little bit about Ronald Reagan yesterday, and the audience gasped a little bit when
it made me laugh.
I riffed a little Ronald Reagan, but you know that's the Irish in me. I can usually come up with an impression when I need it. But you know, I admire President Bush, I admire President Reagan, and I sure do appreciate the chance to be on with you this morning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. We appreciate you being with us.